Hi folks, welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we continue Module 5, Pitch, by exploring 5.2, Scales and Melody. Here's what we're going to be doing today. Today we'll be moving on to 5.2, Scales and Melody, which will conclude our basic unit module on pitch, and next we'll be going on into harmony. So today we'll start by talking about scales, then we'll talk about the most important and most common scales: chromatic, major, minor, and pentatonic scales. Then, just very briefly, I'll talk about some less common and more interesting scales and modes. Um, and then we'll move on to melody. And melody is probably one of the most primary elements of music, but also one of the most difficult to describe. Rhythm and harmony can be sort of cataloged and explained much easier than melody, which makes it kind of fun. So we'll talk about melodic contour, and we'll talk about melodic phrasing and variation. There's no assignment due next class, and I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. So as we start to look at scales, first we should think about what a scale is. So I've pulled up a little program here called BitClavier. It's a free program that lets you play around with different types of piano sounds. And let's start by just listening to a C major scale. So that's a scale. It's a 7-note scale that has all of its notes arranged into ascending or descending order. That makes it a scale. So if I take and do this, and I skip around like that, of course you can do that, but you're skipping around the scale. You're not playing the scale exactly the way it is as a scale. So in terms of scales, there are a huge number of scales which are possible in the 12-tone equal tempered system. There are a few that are extremely common. You hear them every day, and others that are more rare. We're going to mostly focus on the common ones today. So the first one I want to talk about is the chromatic scale. And while it's not the most musical, it helps reinforce our understanding of the tuning system. So the chromatic scale is simply the 12-note scale that ascends with all or descends with all of the 12 possible pitches. So that just means that the 12 notes that we have in 12-tone equal temperament, it's just all of them in a row. So that would be like this. So I'm starting and ending on C, so that would be the 13th note, but there are 12 individual notes. So that's the chromatic scale. It could start anywhere, it could start on any note, and it moves up by half step. So you remember me mentioning in the last lesson, the half step is the basic unit of this tuning system. The half step is any of the smallest interval possible, moving from one note to the next adjacent note. So those are half steps. So you remember probably that 2 half steps makes a whole step. So you could start that anywhere, but this is a whole step. This is a whole step. This is a whole step. That's called a whole tone scale, which we can come back to. It's not one of the normal scales, but scales are normally made up of a mix of half and whole steps. And most scales have 7 notes. So we talked about how the pitches get their names: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and there are 7 of them. That's directly correlated with the fact that most scales have 7 notes. So that is I would say probably 90% of scales have 7 notes, maybe even more like 95 plus. That is to say that 95% of the time when you hear a scale, it has 7 notes. There are many, 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 weird scales out there with 6 or 8 notes, but you just don't hear them very often. So you can think about usually a scale having 7 notes. Of course, the chromatic scale has all 12 notes. Now, the chromatic scale, like I said a minute ago, is not usually used musically because it's just all the possibilities. It is used in contemporary, like modern classical music. You may hear something called serialism or 12-tone music, and that involves all of the pitches. But that's really very, very rare. So think about the chromatic scale as mostly being a study tool for learning how to play all 12 pitches. Whereas the ones we're about to get into, like the major scale, have 7 notes. Another quick little aside is that on a guitar, it's very easy to see and play the 12 steps of the chromatic scale because you just move up one fret at a time. So if you start with an open string, you go fret 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Then you've played a chromatic scale. So if you have a guitar around or any normal fretted instrument besides the dulcimer, you will be playing a chromatic scale as you move up and down the frets. So now let's talk a little bit about some of these 7-note scales. And for that, I want to use what we call solfege. So this is a term, solfege, S-O-L-F-E-G-E, that it's the name of the do-re-mi system. So if you've ever heard do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, that's called solfege. It's just the name of it. You could say do, re, mi, and you're referring to solfege. The reason that I would like to use this in our class a little bit, for one reason, it's somewhat common. It's in The Sound of Music, and elsewhere in culture you will hear people refer to do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. But the other main reason I want to talk about this in our class is because the solfege is not attached to a specific key, and therefore it lets us talk about the notes of a scale without being tied to a specific key. So for example, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti could be, if we look back here, that's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti in C major, but I could also do that same thing in a different key, for example, E flat major. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. So you hear the same distances between each of those notes. You hear the same pattern. It started in a different place, so it's in a different key, like we talked about in the last lesson. But if I just say things to you like, okay, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D, those are specific pitches, and it doesn't show the relationship to the scale. We don't know what key we're in necessarily. We don't know, we don't get to see how the scale works on its own. We would just be hearing it in one key. So we're going to use some letter names like this, and we'll also use solfege to talk about these things. So again, on the piano keyboard is laid out, or any keyboard is laid out with this configuration of white and black keys. They're not hierarchical. It's mostly a visual aid, because if they were all the same color and all the same shape, not only would it spread out wider, but it would be very difficult to know where you are because there's no break in the pattern. So you notice that there's a set of 2 black keys here and 3 black keys here with no black key in between B and C and E and F. Thus, it helps you find, for example, where C is, because it's the note right below the 2 black key section. So scales involve white and black keys, a mix of them depending on the scale, but C major is a classic example, sometimes called the people's key, because it is so easily played on the piano. You can just run your fingers up the white keys and you've played C major. Do, re, mi, fa, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So there's a correspondence between the 7 notes of a scale and the 7 white keys, and also the 7 letter names, A through G. So the major scale is the specific ordering of these notes, or we might say intervals. And so you can see that, as I said, with the chromatic scale, we have all 12 notes. So that means that every step is a half step. That's the chromatic scale with 12 notes. But with a major scale, we only have 7 notes. And of course, again, it's easy to play. But you do want to take note that there are a mix of whole steps and half steps. Remember, a whole step is 2 half steps. So the first thing we have is a whole step. Second is a whole step. Then we have a half step here, because even though they're both white keys, there's no black key in between, so it's a half step. Then whole step, whole step, whole step, and finally one last half step. So it's a mix of whole and half steps. You can memorize that if you want. You're not going to be tested on that, but it's whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And that's the arrangement of the whole and half steps in the major key. So the major key is the most common scale, the major scale is the most common scale, and just below that in terms of commonality is the minor scale. So the minor scale we're going to play here, and I've noted it's technically speaking this is the natural minor scale. We can just think about it as the minor scale, but if for those of you who know some music theory, you may know that there are a couple different versions of the minor scale, and this one technically is the natural minor scale. So the minor scale can be played also on only the white keys. So that means that it can have the same groups of whole and half steps, but the difference is it is in a different tonal center or a different key. You notice this little M that I put here for that shows it's A minor. That's just shorthand for saying A minor. And when you see just a letter alone for a chord or a key or a scale without anything else, it's assumed to be major. So I say this is in C. That means that's short for in C major. Here I say in AM. That means in A minor. So again, same notes. You can see here, major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. But down here, the difference is we start and end on A instead of C. So let's hear that now. So when it comes to the solfege, one of the ways to think about that is the same thing as do, re, mi, but we just start and end the scale on la. So we do la, la, do, re, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, sol, la. One of my keys got stuck there. Let's do that again. La, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Now there is another way to do that, which we're not going to get into, but for those of you who have run across it, it's called movable do, and that's where we keep this as do, and we change the names. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, te, do. You don't need to remember that, but that's just an FYI. The easiest way to think about it is you can play the major scale with all the white keys starting on C. You can play the natural minor scale with all the white keys starting on A. The relationship between those two keys is called relative. So C major and A minor are called relative keys, and that relative term just means that they share the same notes, but they start on a different tonal center. So the last of the common scales that we're going to talk about is the pentatonic scale. So these are the four scales that I would like you to know: the chromatic scale, the major scale, the natural minor scale, and the pentatonic scale. Now, the pentatonic scale is, as you might tell from the name, is a scale with 5 notes. That's what pentatonic means, 5 notes. So we talked about the fact that most scales have 7 notes. Pentatonic is an exception to that. It's a pretty fascinating scale. It's very simple and easy, and it was invented in many places in the world separately. So it cropped up in early African music, in Asian music, in Native American music, and elsewhere. And so there are reasons for this. It's very pleasing, and it has a little bit less of the directionality of the major and minor scales. It's a little bit more stable at any given time. Let me show you what I mean. So we talked about how the white keys of the piano, there's 7 of them, and you can play the major or the minor scale using those. With the black keys, if you use only the black keys, you can play the pentatonic scale. It's just those 5 notes. So you can play the pentatonic scale that way. And the pentatonic scale, another way to think about it in terms of the solfege is it's like we take the solfege here, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and we play it without 2 of the notes. So we say do, re, mi, and we get rid of fa, sol, la, and we get rid of ti. So we have do, re, mi, sol, la. That's the pentatonic scale. The pentatonic scale can be either major or minor, depending on where you start. It's actually the same relationship of relative major and minor that we saw with the 7-note scale. But in this case, if you play on the black keys, you would start here for the major version. Do, re, mi, sol, la, do. Or you would start here for the minor version. La, do, re, mi, sol, la. So those are major pentatonic and minor pentatonic, but both of them use the same notes. It's the pentatonic scale. One of the advantages of this scale is that any pitch in the scale will sound relatively pleasing, or what we'll call consonant, with any other note. So you might say there are no wrong notes, whereas with the major or minor scale, if you just start bashing down white keys, you may find some rather unpleasing or dissonant combinations of notes. But with the pentatonic scale, part of the beauty and simplicity of it is that you can pretty much play any of these notes at the same time and they'll sound good. Da, 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 da. It's used in a lot of folk music. It's used in a lot of Irish, West African, Indonesian, Native American traditions, and the list goes on and on and on. And it's also used often to harmonize vocals in a key. So you may hear in a song that you hear on the radio, or like in a country or folk song, you may hear the melody of the song be in a 7-note scale, but the harmony vocal part is only singing the notes from the pentatonic. So they don't sing fa and ti, they only sing do, re, mi, and sol and la. And part of that is they can pretty much move around their harmony vocal part to any of these notes and they'll pretty much always sound good. So, just to sum that up, a good rule of thumb for playing the major, minor, and pentatonic on the keyboard is that the white notes on the keyboard make your major and minor scales, starting on either C for the major or A for the minor. And the black keys by themselves make the pentatonic major or minor, or just the pentatonic scale, we can call it. And then, of course, the chromatic scale uses all the black and white keys. So I've connected my MIDI keyboard up to this BitClavier program so that I can play around with some of these, and we'll just hear a couple more examples. So again, the chromatic scale. If you played some music in the chromatic scale, it might sound like this. I'm kind of just messing around, but that's sort of how you would use it. You'd just be incorporating all 12 keys. Here now is the major scale again, starting on C. Some music in that might sound like this. And the minor scale starting on A. And then the pentatonic scale using only the black keys. So you may hear, like I was saying, that I can play any of these notes at the same time and they'll pretty much sound good together. Out our discussion of scales, just wanted to give a little untested bonus material here. Part of my idea is that you should know that other scales exist, and it helps you hear what the normal scales sound like. So none of these are included on our quizzes, but there are some other types of scales. So the first type is what are called modes. Modes are the same configuration of whole and half steps as a major or minor scale. So for example, the white keys. But they have a different tonal center. So it's actually the same way that A minor and C major derive from all the white keys. The same can be true starting on any of the other keys, for example, on the D key. So if you play all the white notes starting on D, that's called a mode. It's called the Dorian mode, and you could sing that by starting your do, re, mi on re. Re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re. So you can do that starting anywhere, and these scales have the same arrangement of whole and half steps, but now that the starting place of your tonal center is going to give you some different qualities to these scales. So D Dorian mode is kind of like D minor, but with a raised 6. And the one starting on F is called Lydian mode, so that's like a major mode but with a sharp or raised 4. So that's what modes are. They're very interesting if you're looking to compose some music and you already know a little bit about music theory. I absolutely recommend writing some songs in a mode. And then the last counter examples to our normal scales would be other types of scales that do different things. So we said that most scales involve 7 notes, but some of these other scales involve less or more. So one of them is called the whole tone scale. That's where we use all whole steps and no half steps. So on the keyboard, that would look like this. It's often used for dream sequences and underwater sequences in stories and movies. It's called the whole tone scale. You'll also hear it in the music of Claude Debussy and Ravel, and some jazz music as well. Um, there's something called the blues scale. It should be like this. Now, there are actually several scales that are known as blues scales. That's one of the most common. So that only had 6 notes, and you can see the arrangement, the distances between the notes are not only whole and half steps, and the distances between them are a little bit stranger. That's what it looks like. Um, Final example I'll give is an octatonic scale that has 8 notes. That works by alternating a half step and then a whole step. So there's actually 8 notes involved. Very beautiful and mysterious, and is used in a lot of experimental and modern music, but not so much in pop and classical period music. So that's all for scales. Again, the 4 you need to know are chromatic, major, minor, and pentatonic. And this is just some fun bonus material for those of you who are interested. So our last topic for this module is melody. Melody is the individual line that takes the forefront in music. So a melody could be played on an instrument or it could be sung with a voice, but usually it's in the foreground and it's usually one line or one part, so one note at a time. While melody is probably the most identifiable element of music, it's probably what catches our ear, what makes us remember a song. It's also what we would categorize as being probably the most important part of music, or one of the most important parts. It's still probably one of the most difficult to explain, especially to explain what makes a good melody versus a not so good melody. And that's because it's very case dependent and dependent on the context of things. So we want to know what melody is. It's the primary foreground single line part in music. So there's only a few things I want to talk about with melody. The first is melodic contour. So the contour of a melody would be the shape, and that means the shape on the staff or the shape in the spectrum, the shape of moving up and down. There are really no rules to what the contour of a melody should be, but it's one of the only things we can describe about a melody. So for example, an ascending melodic contour would be like this. Da 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 da. Um, that moves around, but on the whole, it moves up, and then it comes back down at the end. So even simpler, da 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 da. That's an ascending melodic contour. Of course, a descending melodic contour would come down. Da 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 da. So you can see in both cases I'm giving examples where they don't move only in that direction, but on the whole they move in that direction. So you have an ascending melody, a descending melody, and then the last one is an arch melody, which just moves up and then down, or in rare cases, down and then up. Um, and that's about it. There's really no rules to what the contour should be, but it's one of the things we can describe about a melody: ascending, descending, or arch. The next thing I'd like to describe is the melodic range. That's also very simple. So any instrument, including the voice, has its range, the lowest note it can play and the highest note it can play. And when we think about a melody falls somewhere in that range, and so that can color and shape its effect on us. So, for example, my voice range maybe goes down to and maybe way up to or higher. And in there, if I were to sing something very low in with a low melodic range, so I'm low in my range. It has a low melodic range, so it has a particular sound because of that. Up here, has a different sound basically because up in my higher range I sound different, my voice is working differently. It's the same with instruments. There are exceptions. The piano is maybe not changed that much as it moves around in its registers or in its range, but a string instrument like a violin sounds very, very bright and intense up high, and it sounds more mysterious and um, dark and full down below. An oboe, for example, is very loud in its low range, and it's very quiet when it gets higher. So each instrument has different parts of its range that'll react differently to the melody. So if you were to write a simple melody and then kind of pick what key, what tonal center to put your song in, you might move around the tonal center, say from C up to D, and shift the overall range of your melody so that it sounds good in your voice and so that it has the right feeling for what you're going for. And the last thing I wanted to discuss about melody is melodic phrases. These are very important, but again, there aren't a lot of rules on what should or shouldn't happen. It just depends. So a phrase of a melody is, let's say, I don't know, 5 to 12 notes or something like that. It's not just one note, but it's kind of about the length that you could sing in one breath, or with a wind instrument play in one breath. String instruments have a length of a bow. They might be able to play a phrase in one or two bows. But if we think about a sentence in speech, a sentence is kind of similar to a melodic phrase. A phrase is something that goes on for a little while and then takes a pause. And that's kind of how we know the phrase is ended. So let's say, da 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 da. This is from I Will by the Beatles. That's one phrase. Da 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 da. So that would be the first phrase, and we could call that A. And so we label them with A's and B's, not the notes A and B, but just this is the A phrase or the first phrase. So that way when we hear that phrase come back, we can call it A again. And when we hear a different phrase, we can call that B or C. So, who knows how long I've loved you? That's A. And then the song goes on. You know I love you still. So if we look at those two melodic phrases, we have A, and then the second one was basically the same but a little different. And we call that A prime, or just a variation of A. So it's still A, but it's a little different. Who knows how long I've loved you? You know I love you still. That second phrase starts the same way with different words, but then it ends on a higher note. So it goes A prime, or A and then a variation of A. And then the third phrase is, will I wait a lonely lifetime? So that's different melodically. It starts up higher and it moves in a different direction. So we would call that B. Will I wait a lonely lifetime? That's B. And then the last phrase of this verse of this song is, if you want me to, I will. That is B prime. So that was almost the same as B, but just slightly different. So A prime, B prime. So each one of those is a phrase, and overall this creates the verse of the song. You who knows how long I've loved you? You know I love you still. Will I wait a lonely lifetime? If you want me to, I will. So it's four phrases. And so you can think about this if you want to study a song, maybe in your listening journal or just on your own, and describe the melody. These are some of the things you can describe. The contour of the melody, up and down, the range of the melody, is it low or high, and the phrases, the melodic phrases, and if you want to get detailed, how they relate to each other. A prime, B prime. The prime is marked with a little apostrophe. So, a section of music could have several phrases. It could have just two phrases. The phrases could be all A's, or they could be A's, B's, C's, and D's. And the key thing to remember there in labeling those melodic phrases is if they're basically the same, you should call it the same letter. But if it's different to start out, and if it feels like a different melody, then call it a different letter. So that's all we have to say about melody for now. Like I say, I think it's one of the most important elements of music, and probably the most evasive in terms of the science and description, because melodies can do a lot of different things, and it's sewn together with lyrics and harmony and rhythm and form, so that what makes a good melody you could almost see as like a keystone piece that brings everything together. So I hope you have fun listening to melodies coming up, and thinking more about this. So that's all for Module 5, and after this we'll be moving on to Module 6, where we get into harmony. See you soon.